Hi, Reading Adam here. I'm back again with my poor laptop camera, and today I wanted to talk about benefits of reading. Now, everybody who likes to read has some story behind why they like to read and why they continue to like to read. It seems to be that people who do a ton of reading don't tend to go backwards. They tend to keep reading more and more, and it just becomes a lifelong habit. 10 years ago, and I'll make another video of how I decided to be a reader. I wasn't a reader all my life. I mean, I read occasional books, but I didn't read a lot. I didn't become a reader till the age of 23, 10 years ago. And I'll talk more about that, how I decided to get into reading and what I did in a specific video. But for right now, I want to talk about a few points that are benefits of reading, reasons why you would want to read, and just some of my thoughts in discussion format on why one would like to read. Seems like an uninteresting topic to talk about. I mean, why? Of course, there are benefits to reading. It's not a subject area that is. Sorry, I had an itch in my nose there. It's not a subject that should be difficult to argue in favor of, because maybe it would be more challenging to come up with a video that are reasons not to read as opposed to reasons to read. Now, let's just focus on the positive for now, and I'll write down later reasons not to read. See if I can actually come up with anything. That's an interesting intellectual exercise that, honestly, I wouldn't even have thought of until literally right now while I'm talking about benefits of reading. So point number one, specific purposes. This is probably the best reason to read. If you need to learn more about a technical subject, if you want to learn something very specific, like you want to learn how to code C++, you want to learn about a specific religion, you want to learn logic or metaphysics, or you want to learn a how-to subject, there's probably an infinite number of how-to books out there. Some are beneficial. Well, all of them are beneficial depending on the context that it is read. So if you're a great people person, maybe you don't have to read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People if you have no trouble winning friends and influencing people already. It might be, you might look at it and flip through it to find a few interesting points, maybe something that you could try differently, or maybe you're screwing something up, or maybe you just want to keep your edge going. There are probably a few reasons why you can read it, but in general, you don't have to read that if you're already really good at it, because it's a very specific how-to book. It's for people who are a bit socially awkward, or they want to increase their ability to sell themselves and have better relationships with people. I guarantee the book is primarily meant for men who struggle in this area. I don't know very many women who struggle in this area. It seems to come natural to them to just have relationships with folks. I don't mean boyfriend, girlfriend, but I mean just talking to people, getting along with people, seeming interested in people. Wherever you go, like, it seems to come naturally to them, something that they're just interested in and would choose to try to be better at. But for men tend to be independent, a bit, maybe like a little bit too much time to themselves, like myself, but Anyway, so I found it very interesting to read How to Win Friends, Influence People, but not everyone would. Not everyone needs to read that. So again, one benefit of reading is specific purpose. You started a new job and there's a book related to that job that probably will help you to read that book. Or you're a scientist or training to be a scientist, it probably would help to read books in that area, see what people are talking about. I have a sip of coffee right now from my Batman mug. So, specific purposes. Now, one book that I recently read, Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White, a student of his. That book is specific. It's so specific that there's jargon in it, and the jargon is the language of grammar. So things like conjunction, things like a gerund and a split infinitive, stuff like that. Specific vocabulary that you would have to understand in order to get more meaning from the book. Now, it's written very clearly, which makes sense because it's about writing more clearly, but you still have to know a certain language in order to fully get meaning from it. So a lot of specific books will have a lot of jargon. You'll have to increase your vocabulary and learn the vocabulary of that topic in order to gain the most benefits from those types of books. Any kind of generalized book or layman's book tends to lack certain jargon and terms that would increase the depth of your understanding of a subject. So Henry Hazlitt talks about this in an essay he wrote on the art of thinking, which is an essay that he wrote in the context of his first book, which is The Science of Thinking. He wrote as a 21 or 22-year-old, and a very interesting book, a specific book. It's about thinking and getting better at thinking, and I found it helpful. But he also had an essay that he wrote much later in life. If he were to rewrite that book, what would he change? What would he add? And one thing that he pointed out is, if you want to improve your thinking, or if you want to improve a specific purpose in your life regarding thinking or learning a subject, you need to increase your vocabulary of that subject. So somebody who studies, he gives an example of somebody who studies trees. When they look at a leaf, they see a bunch of different things that you or I would not see because they have a bunch of different descriptive words. So they could talk to another person who studies leaves and they could use specific words about the shape of the leaf, its size, its color, texture, whatever, but they have very specific scientific words to describe that. So again, if you want to learn any subject even better, it's helpful to learn more depth the vocabulary of that subject. So that's one benefit of reading, is learning a specific topic in more depth. That's a fairly obvious point, but sometimes people just don't read books on topics or subjects that are important to them in their life, and I don't understand that. There are lots of other things to do these days than read, so this isn't 1840. Let me get to point number 2, which is an offshoot of point number 1, and that is, one benefit of reading is by way of study. Sometimes you read just for pleasure, just because you're interested in a book, but you don't study it because it's not anything that you really want to know in depth. However, studying is a part of reading that is gaining a greater understanding of a specific book. So when I read, I have the choice. I can study it, or I can just kind of go through it, just whiz through it. So when you read, you want to choose which books are worth studying and which books are not worth studying. I'll have to make a different video on specifics of studying. You know, how do you study different topics and what books are worth studying. What is worth studying. I'm just making a quick note to myself. So that is, I won't go too in depth because I discussed most of that with point 1 with specific purposes, but studying is a benefit of reading. You must read in order to study, but you don't always have to study in order to, you don't always have to study in order to read. I don't know, I messed that up. Anyway, point number 3. Let's move on. Let's keep this going. I'm at 11 minutes. I want to get this under 15. Well, no, I'm going to get this under 20 if I can, because I still have a couple more points to make before I get too long in my ramble. Number 3, be interesting. That's a benefit of reading. You'll be a more interesting person. Now, of course, you should already be doing points 1 and point 2 in order to really make anything of point 3. What I just mentioned about studying, if you want to use reading as a way to be a more interesting person, you should be studying certain things and really grasping them to be able to talk about them before you can really be interesting about a certain subject. You can't have an interesting conversation with somebody about an author or a biographical character, a person. You can't have a great conversation about one of those topics if you never studied it, if you've only read one book about it and you kind of think of some things, in which case you would want to be really good at asking questions and getting the other person to talk more, because you're going to lack a level of interestingness. Now, that's partially why I'm creating these videos, because I want to be more interesting. I initially made the decision to read a lot because I thought that would make me an interesting person. And then I had a professor at college who was super well read, clearly read an absolute ton. He always assigned a lot of books to be read for each of his classes. He was a history professor, and he was very interesting. He had a lot of incredible stories that he could tell. He was a very good speaker. He was very clear in thought, and he was interesting in the way he talked. He spoke in a way that, I mean, it's not like he had interesting stories, but he spoke monotone. He spoke very well, and that kind of was like an aha moment to me, like, oh yeah, you know, if I can become a very interesting person if I do a ton of reading and learn all this stuff. Now, reading alone will not actually do that. This person that I'm talking about, this professor, he didn't just read a ton, he studied a lot, and he reread a lot of the things that he read, because it was his job to teach you that. So he needed to be able to talk about those topics at a higher level. So if you want to be interesting, you can't just read, because things will go in one ear and out the other in terms of your mind, your brain. It'll just go in your brain and out of your brain. So you have to study in order to remember enough to actually make coherent thoughts about that subject that you've been discussing, which is why a first-year teacher sucks compared to a teacher who's been doing it for 30 years. Because of experience, they've had a lot more time to think about and talk about subjects, so they're by default far more interesting to talk to because they know a lot more. And not only do they have all the information, and maybe even way more information than the first-year guy, they're used to making sense out of that information. And to be interesting means you have to make sense out of the information that you want to get to the other person. So that's another benefit of reading, but you have to do point number 2, you have to really study specific topics, point number 1, in order to be interesting. So number 4, this is my 4th point. Another benefit of reading is to have discussions. Now, I'm creating these videos because I want to have discussions about the books that I read. most of the books that I read, I kind of forget because I don't talk about them, and I might think about them for a day or two after I read it, but then maybe I never think about it again. Maybe I forget what I read, and because I can't have a discussion with anybody in my life about those books, it's kind of like, what's the point? What was the point of that? Because you can't just absorb tons of knowledge and information and then just remain alone. Some people can do that. There was a guy who was captured in Maine. He was some kid who went off into the woods and lived as a hermit for 20 or 30 years. They captured him because he was breaking into homes and stealing food and stuff and books. And he had done a ton of reading and processing of this information, probably a ton of thinking because he was just by himself the whole time. And he came across as interesting because his only conversations with people were through books. So even though he was all alone, he had many discussions, I'm sure, with a variety of authors. And he spoke like a book read. So that influenced the way that he would communicate even. So I thought that was an interesting story that I had read about that guy. And part of the reason why I came up with this point to have discussions is because of Harold Bloom, who's a major reader. He's a professor at Yale. He's written many books, including a few books on how to read and why, or why to read and how. And he's written many other books which I enjoy because he's somebody who does a ton of reading, but he compacts all of his reading information and comes out with some conclusions that are well thought of and well researched and quite interesting. The more well researched a point is, it tends to be more interesting, tends to have more meaning behind it. So Harold Bloom recommended reading, and not just reading anything, but reading the very best books, because you can't possibly talk to everyone. You're not going to be able to talk to everyone. Some people are dead. You can't talk to them, literally. Some people are alive, but you don't have access to talking to Stephen King. You can only read his books or listen to his lectures or something. Even kind of successful but not superstar successful guy would be like a Ramit Sethi or Tim Ferriss or Grant Cardone type, like a self-help guru who has written books and has lots of information available, and you might be able to send a comment to them and kind of get a response, but you can't really have a great discussion with anything with these people unless you have a ton of money and can purchase an hour or two or a day of hanging out with them. But there's a reason why books are a great resource, is because you can actually have a discussion with somebody who's not there. Because you can't talk to them. You have to read what they've written in order to sort of talk to them. You're not actually getting live feedback from them. That's why one-on-one teaching is so good. That's why having a teacher who can actually give you live feedback is so beneficial in education. But you can't possibly talk to everyone. Oh my, I'm at 19 minutes. I'm not going to make 20 minutes. This is going to be like 25 minutes. I can see why Stefan Molyneux's videos tend to be so long. It's even when you're trying to make short, trite points, there's so much to talk about that there's no way you can make it. Even as you talk faster, there's no way you can quite get through to all the information you want to discuss. Anyway, I liked reading that point from Harold Bloom's book. The rest of his book was kind of boring to me. In that specific book where he talks about why you should read and who you should read, he's a big advocate of reading the classics. You should only read the very best that has been written, and this is because you don't have enough time to read everything. This is certainly true. There's a massive information glut in our society. There's no way you can read everything. You could really read 80 to 100 to 150 books a year and they could all be stellar books, top quality material, you still won't get to everything. And that's why you need specific, point number one, that's why you need specific things to read, and why you shouldn't just read the latest John Grisham novel unless you absolutely love his stuff and there's, you're involved in the fields that he's writing about, and maybe there's different layers to why you would want to read a lot of John Grisham. But for me, I don't read him at all because I would rather read Dostoevsky, or I would rather read, I don't know, Conan the Barbarian, whatever. So let's move on to the final point, and this was just this is a different sort of benefit of reading that comes about once you start reading a lot. This is becoming a critic. Your reading eye becomes sharper the more you read. Now, when I started reading, I chose to read, let's see if I can change my camera, that makes me more attractive. When I started reading, I read a ton of Star Wars novels. Those were the first books I read. Laugh if you want, but I was thinking, I'd like to do a lot of reading, but I don't know. I had no idea what to read. For some reason, I didn't even think about reading the classics. I think I wanted to read something that was simpler than the classics. I didn't want to just jump into difficult material because I didn't want to stifle this desire to read and grow. So I started with something quite basic. It was a topic, it was a subject I already enjoyed. I enjoyed Star Wars. I understood Star Wars. So I thought, let me just read the Star Wars novels. So I read a bunch of them, I don't know, like 30 or so. And I really enjoyed many of them, particularly the Timothy Zahn Star Wars books. But after a while, I started to get sick of Star Wars. And to this day, that was probably 10 years ago I was reading those Star Wars books. I haven't read one since. I don't care to read Star Wars novels anymore. I felt like I got everything I could get out of Star Wars novels. There wasn't a continued reason for me to read them. I was bored with the subject. I had overread it in a way. I didn't care about the characters anymore. The writing started to look bad to me. I started to see things differently. Like, I would wonder why the Han Solo character, why did he always read like Han Solo from Empire Strikes Back and Star Wars and not the Han Solo from Return of the Jedi? How come he hadn't changed or grown at all? And that was one beef I had with The Force Awakens, is Han Solo was the same Han Solo from the very first movies. So it's like he didn't grow or change or mature at all. I mean, maybe he matured a little bit, but he basically seemed to be catering to the fan base. He was a specific character trope, and it's like, well, he's going to act like Han Solo, and that's how the novels started reading. It was like they started reusing lines from the movies, and it didn't feel like it was Han Solo. It didn't feel like it was written very well. It felt too contrived, too forced. I think that's a problem with maybe fan fiction. I don't know. But same thing with Luke. Why was Luke always a weakling? He was never very competent like he was in Return of the Jedi. And he was way too nice. I started to not really care for the characters and the way they were written. I became a critic. So this happens this is one benefit of reading. I don't know if it's positive or negative benefit. I think positive because it changes up what you want to read. I couldn't read Star Wars the rest of my life. It forced me to find new material to read. I wanted to keep reading. Thank God there's tons of material out there. So I was able to find new stuff to read. And I think this is something true of history as well. people in history who love to read were always interested in new books. And it's once you read one thing over and over and over, and you've gotten everything you can get out of it, you want to move on. You want to do something different, maybe something more challenging. I found that the more that I've read, the more critical I am of what I consider bad writing or fluffed up writing, and I become bored of certain books, and I crave difficult material. So if I read a history book, I read a history book by Jay Winnick. It was American Revolutionary Times, Napoleon, and some stuff going on with Russia during that time period. And it was not very interesting to me. I mean, he wrote it to be interesting and probably to appeal to a wide audience. But to me, because I had already read quite a bit of history, I found it to be poor. Like, I didn't really gain anything from it. Whereas in contrast to that, I read a 4-volume history series by Murray Rothbard. Conceived in Liberty is the 4-volume series, and it basically concerns America from its beginning, the U.S., the colonies from their very beginning, all the way up to shortly after the Revolution. And I found those books fascinating. Now, they are very dry, full of research and information, full of footnotes. He wasn't writing to entertain. He was writing to inform and make arguments. And I found it fascinating, and I really enjoyed reading it, and I was glued to it. Whereas Jay Winnick's book, which was he was trying to be entertaining and really make you fall in love with these historical characters. I didn't find it very good. In fact, I thought it was quite awful. But that's to me, as somebody who doesn't read history at all, they might find that book very accessible and very good, and that might interest them to read more. But for me, it didn't. It didn't do anything for me, and I kind of regretted reading it. But I had read it because I had owned it for years and years and passed it up, and I had this feeling, I want to read all the books I own. So there I go. So one final addition to this final point of becoming a critic. It doesn't mean you're literally a critic. Doesn't mean that suddenly you have new insight into material that others don't. Doesn't mean you know how to properly analyze a book. It just means that you have a sharper eye for what's good and what's not good. And you can quickly tell within a few chapters, you can tell right away if you like how this author writes or not. And that's actually a very useful tool to have. You have to do a ton of reading in order to get to that point. But once you get to that point, you can do what Mortimer Adler calls pigeonholing a book, which means, let's say you're in the library, there's a big shelf of books in front of you, you look at the titles, you see a few titles that are interesting, you pull the book out, you open up the book, you look at the table of contents. Are the chapter titles very vague and mysterious, or are they specific? That tells you something about the book right away. I hate vague chapter titles, especially with nonfiction. If it's fiction, it doesn't matter, but with nonfiction, I like specific chapter titles. I like specific language, so I know it's easier to flip around and find specific things you'd like to know. So then you can flip through and read. You can read like the introduction. You can read the first chapter. You can read the last chapter, the conclusion, the summary, which might summarize the full book for you, especially if it's a self-help book. You might as well read the final chapter. You can go through like 10 of those books in half an hour. But pigeonholing the book, you can read a few chapters and you'll know, is this book worth reading? Like, should I read this full book? Like, this guy writes very well. or he makes really good points, and the stories and the things he talks about all weave together really nicely, and his conclusion, his summary is very sound. His thinking seems very good. Maybe this guy's a genius. I don't know, but you'll know right away if you're reading it and you're like, this is nonsense, this is stupid. So pigeonholing a book, you have to do a ton of reading before you can really develop a sharp eye for good and bad writing. And good and bad writing might just mean what writing is good to you. What do you understand more easily, and which might be completely different what somebody else understands. But there's probably not a ton of variation in that, but usually there's some variation. So you have to develop your own sharp critical eye for good and bad writing. So that's the benefit of becoming a critic. You can make better choices on what you want to read, because there's only a limited amount of reading you can do in your lifetime. Final addition to this becoming a critic point, a phenomenon I've discovered about myself is I get bored with a subject once I've read enough of it. I had read Rich Dad Poor Dad last year, and it convinced me to increase my financial literacy, which made me read like half a dozen books on finances and the stock market, investing, real estate, personal finances, and business related finances. So a lot of different topics in finance, which was an area that I knew was probably important to read and understand, but I had been avoiding because maybe the technical aspects of it, maybe I just thought, maybe I wanted to read for entertainment, not for information. So anyways, I read like half a dozen financial books, and then by the time I'm done with like the last Warren Buffett book I read, I was sick of reading financial books. I was craving some book of literature after that, and I think I did read some classic or something after that, because I was just bored to death of the subject. And I think this happens in school a lot. You have a class, maybe it's a history class, maybe it's a literature class, and you read a bunch of books in that topic, and then what happens is you get absolutely burn out on it. You get sick of it because things start to repeat themselves over and over. You start to see similar threads of thought between or among all of these different books. So the amount of new information you're getting, the amount of new insight, the amount of new interesting material is diminishing. There's a point of diminishing returns the more you get into a single subject. Sometimes you have to read a ton on a single subject because it's your profession, or you have to teach a course on it, or whatever reason. That's one reason why I love this podcast / YouTube video series that I'm going to create, which maybe nobody will ever watch it, maybe nobody will ever see this video. It's still beneficial to me. It still fulfills a need I have in my life, but it also will make this, it scratches the itch of needing variety and novelty with what I read, but also what I can produce on the internet. So I tried creating a website that just specifically focused on copywriting and advertisement, and the point of the website was to try to figure out what's the pitch, what is the pitch behind everything. And I got a few weeks into it, and I felt like I learned so much, and then I kind of didn't care about it anymore. Now, Adler, again, he wrote a book called How to Read a Book. Very interesting book, worth reading. But one of the final area of reading, the final benefit that in his book was called syntopical reading. Again, syntopical reading. That's reading a bunch of books on one topic. And the purpose is to gain much greater insight into that topic, so that you can really have a discussion. So that's combining points 1 and 2, specific purposes and studying, and 3, to be interested in a specific topic, and 4, to have discussions on that topic, and 5, to be a critic on that topic, which is a higher level than being able to discuss it or just be interesting about it. So, or merely to have studied it, or merely to have chosen it as a specific study or specific topic. So, syntopical reading will make you a bit of a critic. If you get bored with the subject, that's a good sign that you've learned a lot about it and you're getting close to mastery, especially if you're just a smarter person in general. The more you understand something, the faster you understand it, the faster you get bored with it too. You learn that you end up forgetting a lot of the things that you think you understand just because you understand it as soon as you read it. You're like, oh, okay, I get that, but then you forget. And that happens to me a lot. That's the purpose of this channel, is to have a discussion about books I've read so I don't just forget it. Now, this is running pretty long. If anyone at all, anyone has watched or heard this up to this point, I commend you on your patience. And I hope also that the pace at which I speak, I know I'm speaking a bit slow, and I'm trying to not have moments of really fast speaking, because if I were watching this and I wanted to hear me out, but I also didn't want to wait 40 minutes to hear me out, I would watch this at an increased speed. I'd listen at an increased speed. So hopefully with my talking like this, a bit slower, makes me a bit more clear, but also still clear even at a higher speed. People who talk slow in videos, that's a good thing because you can speed the video up and still hear everything. Whereas somebody who talks fast, you can't do that, because then it becomes and you can't figure it out. All right, Reading Adam again here, and thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Have a great one.